People said a landlocked nation would never master the seas. They said poor farmers could never feed the giants of the world. They said Africa's role was only to export raw gold and cotton, never dignity and power. For decades, those words were treated as an unshakable truth, echoing through boardrooms from Washington to Brussels. But truth, like soil, can shift. On a morning the world assumed was ordinary, breaking headlines erupted. Burkina Faso and India signed a $14 billion agreement, not for weapons, not for oil, but for grain, sorghum, corn, and the promise of sovereignty. A deal that shook markets not because of the number, but because of its meaning. A poor, landlocked African nation had just redrawn the global map of power, not with armies, not with pipelines, but with the strength of its farmers. Consider the symbolism. For centuries, wheat and corn have been tools of empire. The West wielded food like a weapon, offering aid with one hand while gripping chains with the other. Nations were forced to bend, policies rewritten, leaders replaced, all to keep Africa dependent on imported bread while its raw wealth was siphoned away. This time, the script was torn up. Burkina Faso did not beg for grain. Burkina Faso sold it. Burkina Faso did not kneel to survive. Burkina Faso negotiated for power. And why India? Because India did not arrive with tariffs and lectures. It came with trust, irrigation technology, and respect. It saw not just fields, but resilience. It recognized not just soil, but sovereignty. In that handshake, the world witnessed a crack in the old order. Suddenly, the story of a silent, dependent Africa shattered. And now the question cannot be avoided. If grain can rattle markets and humble empires, what truly decides the future? Guns, gold, or food? Think carefully, because the answer might change how you see not only Africa news, but the entire global stage. If you want to follow this journey, step by step, question by question, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel to follow Africa's transformation, because this story has only just begun. Burkina Faso's 14B grain shock. Who really wins? They said a landlocked nation would never touch the seas. They said poor farmers could never feed the giants of the world. They said Africa's fate was sealed, to export raw gold and cotton. Never dignity, never power. But on that morning, the story cracked. Burkina Faso announced a $14 billion deal with India. Not oil, not weapons, grain, sorghum and maize, wrapped in sovereignty and pride. Markets trembled. Traders called their ministers in panic. Analysts scrambled for explanations. How could a country mocked as too small command the attention of Mumbai and New York in a single headline? They thought it came like lightning. But storms are not born in a single night. They build in silence, gathering strength until the thunder shakes the ground. For years, while the West dismissed Burkina Faso as a backwater of gold mines and cotton fields, quiet hands were planting seeds of a revolution, not just in soil, but in diplomacy. Delegations sat through endless food security summits, whispering in corners, showing capacity, not fantasy. India listened. They didn't demand concessions. They demanded proof. And Burkina Faso delivered, season after season, harvest after harvest, until trust was stronger than any written contract. The symbolism runs deeper than grain. For centuries, the West weaponized food. Wheat and corn became chains disguised as charity. Aid shipments came with tariffs, with lectures, with demands that bent nations to the will of Washington or Brussels. Africa was forced to import survival while exporting its wealth. This deal shattered that script. Burkina Faso did not beg for bread. It sold sovereignty by the ton. And why India? Because India came with respect, not punishment. With irrigation technology, not hidden tariffs. They asked for quality, not submission. They walked the fields, touched the soil, and spoke with farmers face to face. They treated a small nation as an equal, something rarer than gold in today's world. In that handshake, a fracture appeared in the old order. Washington called the deal reckless. Brussels muttered about instability. Their fear was not hunger. Their fear was control. For decades, they wrote the rules of trade: who could sell, who could buy, and at what price. But a landlocked African nation, once mocked as powerless, had just bypassed their monopoly. Suddenly, food was no longer a weakness. It was a weapon of independence. But let us ask, who really wins here? Is it India, securing grain for 1 billion mouths? Is it Burkina Faso, elevating its farmers to the global stage? Or is it the silent millions across Africa, watching and wondering if their soil, too, can be turned into sovereignty? The world sees a contract worth $14 billion, but the truth is bigger. It is the beginning of a South-South corridor where Africa and Asia feed each other without Western permission. It is the quiet dawn of a food order that no longer bows to the IMF or the WTO, and it forces us to confront a question no analyst dares to ask. If food can shift empires more than gold or guns, what truly decides the future? Stay with us as we unravel this. Subscribe now, because the story of Africa's grain revolution has only just begun. When Burkina Faso signed $14 billion, why did the world tremble? When the signatures dried on paper in Ouagadougou and New Delhi, the world did not merely read an agreement. It felt an earthquake. Markets shook. Commodity exchanges in Chicago and London flickered red as traders scrambled to recalculate risk. Headlines poured across Bloomberg, Reuters, and the Financial Times, warning of an unexpected food shock. What shocked them was not the price of maize or sorghum. It was the symbolism. A small African nation had just broken free from the script that bound it for generations. In Washington, the reaction was swift and anxious. Senators convened emergency hearings. Their speeches did not dwell on hunger or poverty, but on strategic disruption. They spoke of supply chains, of food security, of national interest. Yet beneath the technical language was a deeper fear that the monopoly of influence was slipping from Western hands. For decades, the United States used wheat and corn as instruments of diplomacy, leveraging food aid to mold foreign policy. Now, Burkina Faso had turned the tables. Brussels responded with quieter alarm. European ministers muttered about stability and dependency risks. But behind closed doors, officials worried that a precedent had been set. If one small landlocked nation could forge an equal partnership with Asia's rising power, what would stop others? What if Niger, Mali, or Chad followed suit? What if the continent once seen as perpetually dependent began to negotiate on its own terms? In New Delhi, the mood was tense but resolute. India stood at a crossroads. Aligning with Burkina Faso meant challenging Washington and Brussels. It meant risking tariffs, sanctions, or exclusion from Western trade agreements. But it also meant securing food for 1 billion mouths at home, grain delivered not as charity, but at fair prices, through respect and partnership. For the Indian cabinet, the choice was not merely economic, it was civilizational. Would India remain a junior partner in the Western order, or would it gamble on a South-South alliance that could reshape global trade? By dawn, the decision was clear. India chose Africa. The gamble was bold, almost reckless, but history has always favored those who dared. The press declared it a pivot of grain, while think tanks in Washington warned of a new food Cold War. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, the atmosphere was electric. Farmers gathered in village squares, radios buzzing with news. For generations, their backs had bent under the sun. Their calloused hands harvested crops that often vanished into middlemen's pockets or rotted in silos without reaching markets abroad. Now, for the first time, they saw their labor elevated to the global stage. Each sack of sorghum was no longer a mere commodity. It was sovereignty in burlap, dignity measured in tons. But with pride came tension. Rival nations whispered of sabotage. Western corporations began lobbying to undermine logistics. Questions swirled. Could Burkina Faso deliver consistently? Could its fragile infrastructure handle the weight of global trade? The world waited, skeptical, almost eager for failure. Yet within the nation, determination grew stronger. Leaders reminded the people, they said we were too small, too poor, too weak. Today, they measure us by their fear. This was the climax not of a single contract, but of an unfolding drama. The old order had been pierced, and the reactions revealed more than policies. They revealed panic, hope, and the sense that history itself was shifting. And so, the world asked itself, if a landlocked African nation can rattle the pillars of global trade, what else might be possible when the silent rise together, from fields to power? What did 14B do to Burkina Faso? The ink of the $14 billion grain deal had barely dried when its consequences began to ripple through the fabric of Burkina Faso's society. For decades, the nation's farmers worked in anonymity, their labor reduced to statistics in dusty reports. But suddenly, their work was elevated into the language of sovereignty. Every sack of sorghum, every ton of maize became more than a crop. It became leverage, dignity, and a political statement. In the villages, pride surged. Radios crackled with reports of the deal, and farmers who had once felt invisible began to walk with their heads higher. Parents told their children that their future might no longer be chained to poverty. The sense of national identity deepened, as if the soil itself had been vindicated. A nation once mocked for being landlocked now carried itself as if geography was no longer destiny. But with pride came pressure. Expectations rose quickly. Farmers demanded fairer prices for their harvest. Unions called for better infrastructure. And young people, who once dreamed of leaving, began demanding opportunities at home. The government suddenly faced the paradox of success, how to turn global recognition into domestic stability. Politically, the deal transformed the image of leadership. President Traoré, long painted in Western headlines as a defiant military ruler, now stood before his people as the architect of a new economic path. His speeches resonated with fresh authority, not because of military strength, but because of agricultural power. Within Burkina Faso, he became a symbol of resistance turned into opportunity. Yet with visibility came vulnerability. Rival factions within the region whispered about betrayal, coups, and foreign meddling. History had taught Africa that every economic victory attracted enemies. Internationally, the political consequences were immediate. Western governments feared a domino effect. If Burkina Faso could elevate its farmers into global players, what would stop Mali, Niger, or Chad from doing the same? If Africa could feed Asia without Western permission, what leverage would Washington or Brussels retain? In think tanks across Europe and America, scenarios were drafted: economic sanctions, trade restrictions, even covert pressure to destabilize the new alliance. But the greatest consequence was psychological. For the first time in generations, the people of Burkina Faso felt that their sweat could shape geopolitics. Grain was no longer a survival crop. It was a weapon of independence. This realization sparked debates in universities, cafes, and political circles. What if Burkina Faso could extend this model to energy, to minerals, to technology? What if the deal was only the beginning of a broader strategy of sovereignty? Of course, risks loomed. Logistics corridors remained fragile. Roads and rails required urgent investment. Corruption, if unchecked, could erode trust and derail momentum. The very success of the deal created a target on Burkina Faso's back. And yet, the sense of possibility outweighed the fear. The civil and political consequences of the $14 billion grain deal could not be measured in tons or dollars alone. They were measured in confidence, in pride, in the rebirth of a national narrative for a people long dismissed as too poor, too weak, too small. The deal was not merely an agreement with India. It was proof that history could be rewritten by hands once calloused in silence. And the world now faced a question it had never dared to ask. If the poorest farmers in Africa could shake the pillars of global politics, what would happen when the entire continent followed? A grain deal that shook Washington. What's next for the world? In Washington, the word grain suddenly carried the weight of a missile. The $14 billion deal between Burkina Faso and India was not just an economic transaction. It was a strategic shock. Senators in closed rooms spoke not of sorghum or maize, but of national security. For decades, the United States had used food as an invisible weapon. Aid packages tied to policy demands, wheat shipments that bent governments into alignment, and trade rules that ensured Africa remained dependent on Western supply chains. But now, a single handshake between Ouagadougou and New Delhi threatened to unravel that architecture. American think tanks rushed to issue reports. Some warned of a food Cold War, predicting that if Africa and Asia forged an independent corridor of trade, the West would lose one of its most reliable tools of influence. Others feared a domino effect, that if Burkina Faso could realign itself with Asia, so too could Mali, Niger, and beyond. What began as a contract over grain was morphing into a challenge to the geopolitical hierarchy. In Brussels, the mood was more subtle, but no less anxious. European leaders spoke of risks to stability and the dangers of dependency. Yet the truth was simpler. They feared losing their grip. For years, the European Union positioned itself as Africa's primary partner, setting terms that favored European industries while limiting African growth. This deal shattered that illusion by bypassing Western frameworks entirely. Burkina Faso and India had shown that alternatives were possible, and once the idea of alternatives spreads, control slips away. Meanwhile, in Beijing, the reaction was quiet calculation. China had long invested heavily in African infrastructure, but this deal caught even seasoned observers by surprise. Grain, not gold or oil, was now the front line of influence. Analysts in Beijing debated whether to join, compete, or wait. For China, the lesson was clear. Africa was no longer the continent of extraction. It was becoming the continent of negotiation. Elsewhere across the global south, the reaction was inspiration. From Latin America to Southeast Asia, leaders whispered about the precedent being set. Could food, the most basic of resources, become the foundation of new alliances beyond Western reach? Could sovereignty be measured not in armies, but in silos of maize and wheat? Yet for all its global implications, the most pressing questions still lay at home. Could Burkina Faso sustain this momentum? Could it protect the deal from sabotage, sanctions, or the immense pressures that come with defiance? For Washington and Brussels, the hope was that cracks would appear. For Ouagadougou, the task was to prove the opposite, that this was not a one-time miracle, but the birth of a new system. The American lens sees risk. The European lens sees loss. The Chinese lens sees opportunity. And the global South sees hope. But all of them, whether anxious or inspired, agree on one point. The world has changed. A landlocked African nation, once dismissed as powerless, has forced capitals from Washington to Beijing to reconsider the future of food, trade, and sovereignty. And now, the question lingers, if grain can shake empires, what will Africa do next? Stay with us as we uncover the next chapter of this unfolding story. Subscribe now, because the age of Africa's awakening is only beginning. After 14B grain deal, is Africa writing its own future? The $14 billion grain deal between Burkina Faso and India was not the end of a story. It was the opening chapter of a much larger struggle. For every handshake captured by cameras, dozens of unseen challenges now rise to meet the nation. The road ahead is filled with both opportunity and peril, and how Burkina Faso navigates it may define not only its destiny, but the trajectory of Africa itself. The first challenge lies in infrastructure. Grain does not move on pride alone. It requires rails, ports, storage, and security. Burkina Faso, still fragile in logistics, must transform its backbone of trade or risk collapse under